Join us for an adventure into the rugged lands where the Sasquatch legend began nearly a century ago. British Columbia is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. This is where giant, rugged mountains hug the temperate rainforest-dotted coastline of the mighty Pacific Ocean. British Columbia's epic beauty stands in a class of its own, perhaps challenged only by neighboring Alaska for most incredible region of North America. It's hard not to look around in British Columbia and be thinking to yourself that something akin to Sasquatch existing here would seem to make sense. That has now been pondered for over a century. British Columbia as a region has a very large role in the early days of the Sasquatch topic, as it continues to have. In fact, 2 of the 4 so-called original 4 horsemen of Sasquatch research operated out of British Columbia. Journalist John Willison Green was one of the first to begin compiling a record of Sasquatch sightings, amassing more than 3,000 sightings from across North America by the time of his passing in 2016. Green was born in Vancouver, British Columbia. Rene Dahinen was born in Switzerland, but relocated to British Columbia at age 23, becoming one of the first investigators to look into the Sasquatch mystery, including events in the Bluff Creek region in the late 1950s, as well as the Patterson-Gimlin film in 1967, and he continued to stomp around the Pacific Northwest until his passing in 2001. The other 2 of the 4 horsemen included American anthropologist Dr. Grover Krantz and Irish-born explorer Peter Byrne, both of whom operated in areas of the American Pacific Northwest known for Sasquatch, with Krantz being in Washington State until his passing in 2002, and Peter Byrne in Oregon until his very recent passing in July of 2023. Given that half of the original so-called 4 horsemen were operating here in BC has had sort of an outsized footprint, I would say, in the Sasquatch topic. It's been very influential. Why do you think that is?
Because it started here. Right here across the river in the Stahis Reserve, that's where the name Sasquatch was first coined. This is where everyone came. Like Willow Creek is called the gateway to Bigfoot country in the Pacific Northwest United States, Harrison Hot Springs in Canada is the gateway to Sasquatch country. This is where it began. Even though it was all over the place, this is where it really got attention. John Green was an absolute skeptic. at first, when he first met a young Rene Dahinen asking information on the Sasquatch. He tried to dissuade him. But it turned out the other way around. Rene had influenced John, and John started hearing, geez, we're not talking about big Indians with long hair, we're talking about an ape-like creature here. He started looking into it, and thus history was made. The four horsemen led the path for others to follow, right? There was actually a man even before them, an ex-deputy sheriff from the United States called Joseph Dunn, who came up here in 1941 to look at the Ruby Creek tracks. Unfortunately, he died in 1948. We don't even know why he was interested in the subject in the first place, but he was. He predates Rene and everybody, so when you think about it. And of course, J.W. Barnes, who was writing the article introducing BC's hairy giants, brought the name Sasquatch to the public mind in British Columbia.
He was talking with a lot of the First Nations people there because he'd heard about this thing called the Sasquatch, right? And of course, at the time, a lot of white people just assumed this was something that was not real, it was just a legend kind of thing. But he took it serious enough to actually interview different people and do some research. And he wrote an article that was put in a magazine in the 1920s.
His article of April 1st, 1929, introducing BC hairy giants, introduced the Sasquatch to the non-native community and all of Canada. And it's been known in Canada as Sasquatch ever since.
If you look at earlier stories, even throughout the U.S., there's some newspaper stories from Pennsylvania, all throughout the different western states where there have been sightings since then. They often use the term wild man, or and you think about it, back in those days, unless a circus came through town, people had no idea what a gorilla was, right? You don't start seeing the word where they say it looked like a gorilla until around the 1920s or 30s, when circuses would have gorillas, people would see pictures of gorillas and this kind of stuff. So before that, there was never any reference to what a gorilla was for people. So the term wild man made sense. This thing walked on two legs, left human-like footprints, had hands, but was covered all in hair, right? So it's interesting to see that progression of how the name has changed and that now when people see it, they say it was ape-like, because we know so much about apes. There's tons of videos of apes on YouTube. People have seen them in zoos and stuff like that. So it's interesting to sort of see how over time the images and that change of the perception of what people see and what kind of words they use to describe what they saw.
With the concept of Sasquatch being introduced into Canada as early as the 1920s, that would mean it predated, if not coincided, with stories of the Yeti or the abominable snowman of the Himalayas that were taking place in the 1920s and 30s and into World War II. The term Sasquatch certainly predated its American counterpart of Bigfoot, which didn't come into widespread use until the late 1950s. What I find so fascinating about some of these old articles, such as this one from 1934, is how now, almost 100 years later, the descriptions of the creatures themselves, as well as alleged behavior, are still very consistent. This could easily read as a contemporary report on Bigfoot anywhere in North America, yet it predates the internet by over half a century. However, it should be noted that we are still asking the same kinds of questions about Sasquatch nearly a century later, while still being enthralled by this enigmatic mystery. While these are the origins of the modern Sasquatch phenomena, one cannot mention this topic without crediting the indigenous First Nations peoples, who in British Columbia in particular had a whole host of folklore and awareness of hairy man-like creatures in the woods, which, as mentioned, gave way to the term Sasquatch.
Well, just here on Vancouver Island, the three different linguistic families of First Nations people all had different names for the wild man, or the Bukwa, Sinakwa, Matlus, Siatko, Sasquatch. But I think definitely for British Columbia, it was because of the First Nations influence in art. You see it so much in the West Coast art, not so much in interior of the BC province art, or in Alberta, or in, and I can't speak for Washington or Oregon or California, don't know a lot about that area as far as First Nations art depicting images of a Sasquatch type creature. But I'm assuming that probably ones along the coast probably would have, because it would have been something that they had a very good chance of encountering in the woods or seeing.
With the various First Nations groups came different interpretations of perhaps the same creature. But without putting too much of my own spin on their folklore and stories, I will leave that topic for another occasion, such as in an upcoming Beyond the Trail film in which I spent the better part of a week in Bella Coola, British Columbia, in the traditional lands of the Newhalk First Nation, learning of their folklore of the Snuneymuxw and similar wild man-like creatures. For myself, this is a bit of a personal journey, as visiting British Columbia had been a lifelong goal. With it being a place so steeped in Sasquatch history, it had been at the top of my list of places to visit for quite some time. Those that have already seen my Alaska Bigfoot Highway film previously would have seen some of the remote stretches of highway I drove through in order to get to Alaska. Much of the Alaska Highway itself winds through parts of remote northeastern British Columbia and its stunning northern Rocky Mountains. While I heard plenty of Sasquatch stories on that Alaska Highway route, the region of northern BC felt like a world away from the southern reaches of the province that I visited during the filming of this movie, which happened prior to the Alaska Highway journey. It might as well have been a world away. British Columbia is so enormous that it is larger than every single US state with the exception of Alaska. With such a wide expanse, BC is the most mountainous province in Canada, and it's most varied in terms of terrain.
Picture the most beautiful place in the world in your imagination. You got it, British Columbia. Beautiful west coast and high alpine forests from end to end, north to south, east to west, mountains, lakes, wildlife, and very few people. Perfect combination.
Well, I mean, it's a varied province in the sense if you drive, right now we're in Merritt, which is sort of open grassland, plain type area, and very hot in the summer and very cold in the winter. You drive over to the Okanagan, well, they have rattlesnakes and there's deserts and stuff like that. And then you go up into the Kootenays and you get more of the high altitude Rocky Mountain type pine forests and that. Over on the west coast, which is only like an hour's drive from here, you get into the more rain coast climate. So it really, there is about 4 or 5 different climatic, different places in the province.
Imagine Jurassic Park. I mean, especially here on the coast and on the island, the forest is so dense with all this rainfall, so much understory. You have plants that grow leaves, just absolutely devil's club. You'll find leaves like this, and yeah, you're walking through and you think you're in a Jurassic Park set. So I think that's a pretty good summation of the coastal areas in any case. But then, there's such a variety of terrain. And it's amazing, especially along the coastlines. You get up to Alaska on the coast. My friend Charles, who was a state trooper up there for 20 years, I took him into an area where I'd been finding prints, and we were walking through the area, and he says, Jason, I could say I'm in Alaska right now. This looks identical to where I lived in Alaska. And it's like that all the way down the coast, Washington, Oregon, into Northern California. It's very, very similar.
While driving through the stunning southern end of the BC coastal mountain ranges north of Squamish, I was on the lookout for the general area of a rather interesting reported Sasquatch sighting. Alright, this is pretty cool. This was a sighting reported to the Bigfoot Mapping Project that was reported after our Louisiana video where I went out with Scott. And it's pretty cool where this is the location where it happened. I'm just going to read the whole report. This area is approximate. I was 20 years old while driving through the depths of the winding Crazy Mountain Pass where you don't have cell phone reception and no people for hours. 5 of us were traveling in my pickup truck through the Duffy Lake Road back to our hometown of Squamish, BC, which means they would have been going down that way. It was dusk, no traffic, and we were already on high alert for animals on the road. As we went around a bend, something with 2 legs ran off the side of the mountain, then crossed the road in 2 strides over a Jersey barrier, into the trees, down a steep cliff, into a wooded drop-down. It crossed in front of us, and we had a clear view in the headlights. We all screamed, "Oh my God, did you see that? What was that? Did you see that?" I think it was a Bigfoot, and we all agreed that we thought it was a Bigfoot. We slammed on the brakes, reversed back where we saw it. Jumped out of the truck, we looked over the Jersey barrier and made sure there weren't any sort of tourist area or a trail for humans. There was absolutely no way it could have been human or they'd be dead from the fall because we couldn't see it and could never cross the road that fast. Then we talked about it the whole way home, so we drove slower looking for any more animals or another Bigfoot. I've never forgotten this, as Squamish is an old logging town. My parents, grandparents, and everyone we know growing up worked out on the logging roads and in remote camps and always had stories of Bigfoot coming through camp. It's part of the Coast Salish native culture as well, and it's a known fact of existence where I'm from. We had cougars, bears, wolves, every animal imaginable living in the mountains and traveling through our backyard, and Bigfoot was another thing to watch out for and be aware of for our safety growing up. I'm not native, but the kids would travel to Squamish to play sports with us from Mount Curry Indian Reserve, and they always told us about the train tracks in Mount Curry, who are a known hotspot for Bigfoot and have been for decades. So that's pretty cool. This person literally reported this sighting after our Louisiana video. P.S. I only found out about your Bigfoot map app through the drop of the Small Town Monsters Louisiana Sasquatch search that came out 11 hours ago. Thank you for being a part of it and bringing us the great content as always, allowing them to get the word out about your app and what you're doing to show more viewers. I'm watching from Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada. It's a classic road crossing sighting, so majority of Bigfoot sightings are road crossings. People see something run out or it's running in front of the road, so nothing super spectacular, but it is cool to be able to be in the location and know that you only know about the sighting because you put out a video about it. So we have no idea where it could have come down from over here or jumped over in that side. Could be anywhere in this whole area. So there's not many people out here. It's just pretty much us.
It's just us.
Well, this was an interesting sighting to highlight. Full credit goes to Scott of the Bigfoot Mapping Project for the work he's put into it by using multiple sighting databases such as the BFRO and others. In fact, he just recently added a majority of John Green's data into the map, which is a significant contribution considering how Green began compiling this list well before the internet, creating one of the first ever compilation of sightings from across Canada and the United States. Scott reminded me that some of the Green sightings might not have been the exact approximate locations, but the general area. However, if anybody watching this has had a sighting or experience, I encourage you to submit them to the Bigfoot Mapping Project, along with any photos or videos you might have captured, including adding the specific location if you feel comfortable sharing that. When it comes to Sasquatch reports in British Columbia, just from this region of southern BC, we can see quite a number of them reported over the years. But as I experienced with the BC sections of the Alaska Highway, sightings come from across the province.
If you're looking at it in terms of Sasquatch, there's a lot of Sasquatch sightings in the Kootenays. There's a lot on the west coast, so in the Coast Range Mountains. And there's a few in the central part of the province where it's a lot more open. There's still sightings, but not as many. Now, of course, where you have sightings, you need to have people. So obviously, there could be lots of spots on the coast where there could be numerous Sasquatch, but if there's no one there to see it, we have no information because all of our information is based on eyewitnesses. So wherever there's people, then you can have a Sasquatch sighting. If there's no people there, there's no Sasquatch sighting. Doesn't mean there's not a Sasquatch there. But again, that's our main basis of how we have to look and deal with our research.
Is there a report that you've investigated in BC that to you really kind of stood out as maybe for you particularly interesting, or one that you care to share?
There's actually quite a few. I'll just say my first one that I did a report on was from I'd say it had to be early 60s. I can't remember exactly, but it was early 60s. And the reporter was, at the time, it was actually her son who had posted it. By this time, she was now living at a senior center in Qualicum Beach. But when it happened, she was a young girl living in Courtenay. Where the house was probably mostly forest at the time. It's still right close to the bush right now. And they had a 2-story house. The house is still there. Didn't have an immediate neighbor right next to them, but there was one kind of kitty corner behind. They had come home from visiting relatives. It was in around Christmas time. There was a bit of snow on the ground, and they arrived home early Monday morning. Got out of the truck, and she looked across the street, and there was something standing in the ditch, trying to hide behind a telephone pole. And she was saying, "Dad, what's that? Dad, what's that?" And Dad took a look and lost it. "Get in the house, get in the house." So they ran into the house. A couple days later, she looked out from her bedroom window into the yard, and there was a line of footprints that went across the yard, stepped over a 4.5-foot fence, and kept on going. She thought her brothers had been out playing around, but they were still in bed. That's kind of weird. The neighbor kitty corner from them used to have sheep, and I actually talked to these people as well. And they would say they had a dozen sheep. They would wake up in the morning, and instead of a dozen, they had 11. They would blame her dogs of taking a sheep. Well, you have to do some rational thinking here. If the dogs were chasing sheep, the sheep would make a lot of noise. What if it was a cougar? Same thing.
That's okay.
The sheep would be making a lot of noise. A bear that was really hungry? Probably the same thing, but the fence was never broken. What about wolves? Well, wolves do the same thing, but wolves would kill it there. The cougar could kill it and then take it away. There may not be a lot of blood. So, because predator cats tend to go someplace else to actually feed on their kill. But there wasn't. It was like they went to bed and there was 12, they woke up and there's 11. The other thing it could be is, what if it was a bunch of rotten kids? But would they let one sheep out, or would they let them all out? You know? So you have to think about this stuff. But if you're an 8-foot tall hairy thing that looks like a person, sheep aren't going to be afraid. Step over, tuck one under the arm, and walk off. Too easy.
Well, I've interviewed a lot of people that have had sightings, and you know, the one thing I can honestly say with a lot of the reports is, I mean, these people are often taken back. Like, they did not go out and expect to see something, right? I always say the William Rowe sighting, which is in John Green's book, I find that one as being such a good sighting. I mean, it's very dry in the details as to what he saw and stuff. And the other curious thing is that years later, John Green wrote that he ran into somebody who was a biologist, and when they said, "Oh, I read your book on the Sasquatch, and I saw that there was a thing there by William Rowe," and he says, "You know, I do research on prairie antelope," and William Rowe was a hunter. He was able to give descriptions of these prairie antelope out in Saskatchewan. And the guy says, you know, this fellow was talking, was a biologist, and he says, you know, his descriptions were so spot on that I always looked forward to any information that he was sending in to us about his sightings. He was just a person who had the right opportunity to watch something long enough before it noticed him and left. And then he got his daughter to do the sort of drawing that's kind of famous, I guess. It's in John's book. I just always thought that one was great in the sense that just a very basic sighting. He was sitting sort of in the shadows, having a break, and this thing kind of walked into his view, and like a lot of people, like our hunter, he just sort of sat there and just watched, and this thing was able to do what it was doing, and then it just saw him and then got up and walked away, describing basically what like 98% of all the reports are. This thing just does not want to stick around, so it's not as if anything's farcical about it or anything.
I did a conference, well, not a conference, but it was a BC overland rally, so the overland crowd. And I asked to do a campfire chat. All right, so it's sort of the end of the night thing where the people talk about their overlanding adventures all over the world. And the organizer was a little, I don't know about that. You know, this isn't really that crowd. He says, but I'll admit I'm intrigued. He says, well, we'll give you a booth. Well, at the 11th hour, I guess it was a cancellation, so he called me up and asked me, could you do the first night, do the campfire chat? So I did one, did about a 45-minute to an hour presentation, a short Q&A, because there wasn't a lot of Q&A from this crowd. And then I asked, is anybody feeling brave enough to stand up and talk about something that happened to them that they have trouble explaining? Of course, nobody stood up. But I was there for another 3 days, and I'd be walking around exhibits, and people would approach me, and their eyes darting, and they go, are you the Sasquatch guy? And I'm like, yeah. And they would lead me around behind an exhibit, and it was just like a cat puking up a hairball, just, it all comes out. Because, they haven't been able to tell anybody, right? They feel safe. I can talk to this person and they won't judge me. So, yeah, that was interesting, to say the least.
Well, I do research on what happens to somebody who comes into the Bigfoot community, plus the Bigfoot community is a system, to see if I can somehow offer some assistance in regards to what we're missing in regards to tracking them down, because I think there's two main reasons why I do what I do, and that is tracks are facts to me. And the main other reason that I'm really focused on right now is dealing with people who have PTSD because of bumping into them. And that's really, you can't hoax that. At least you couldn't to a guy like me, because I'm used to dealing with people with PTSD. So, and there's something there that tells me when they're sharing their stories with me that there's something there. Not to mention I've come across tracks that I don't have explanations for, and I'm fairly versed in tracking. I know specific people that I think have definitely had an experience with Sasquatch. And what tells me that is the body language, the PTSD they suffer, they're medicated, their siblings also tell of their concern ever since an incident point. It's not overlapping trauma. Overlapping trauma is if you had trauma in your past and you bring it forward to another event of the unknown in the present. It's not that. And those people, it's a disservice, I think, a lot of times for us to continue where we're going and where we're not really helping those people get out of a traumatic experience. Imagine if you saw a Sasquatch, you really saw a Sasquatch, and then you come online looking. Think how frustrating that would be after being in it for a long time to search for answers to get your psychological well-being back. How are you supposed to get it back when you come into the Bigfoot community when nothing's solid, embedded, and guaranteed? Lots of claims of it. So what happens when you have a traumatic experience is you rehash it over and over again, and what the brain's doing is trying to give you a different outcome in case it happens again. But the problem with it, and so what an example of that is, say I come across a bear. Matter of fact, I'll give you an exact example. One of my friend's wife and him were sitting on the beach having a picnic on the island in Vancouver, and this bear came down the trail. And when the bear came down the trail, he could see the bear was coming down the trail, and he was grabbing his bear mace, and he was saying, don't do anything. It's the last thing you say to somebody. It's like saying, I'm going to tell you something, but don't worry about it. It's the last thing you say, right? And so he's saying, I don't want you to be upset. Don't say that either, because they're going to get upset, especially when you say there's a grizzly bear coming down behind you, and he can see that there's a grizzly bear coming down behind him. Now, when you're doing a narration like that, you're trying to help people move past it. But what happened with her was the bear came down. He took their lunch, because they're having like a picnic, and threw it at the bear, which I don't recommend you doing. Not because it caused any problems for them. It's because you just reinforced the bear be around humans. And so she spent the rest of the holidays on the hot tub on the front porch. But the problem is she's ruminating of all the things that happen. So what she's actually doing is combining, and what's happening in the brain is trying to make all the scenarios so you can figure out what's going on. But if you don't have enough data or information, you're stuck, and you get stuck in it. So she wouldn't go down to the lake or to the ocean front or anymore, because in her brain she's still worried that this is going to happen. But she's missing the end of the story. None of it happened. Meaning none of the bear attacked you, you didn't die, but the fear of it is what locks people into the PTSD. And so when I'm dealing with people for PTSD, I have a lot of people and again, it's part of my, I think, I would say savantness of myself is I can tell when someone's telling me the truth and when they're not telling the truth. I'm trained in body language. I can tell when someone owns the story compared to someone saying they own the story, or when someone's telling me a tale of a story. The good storytellers are really hard sometimes to tell whether they're telling you a story. That's what makes them good storytellers. I'm not saying there's anything deceptive about those type of people, but you have to learn about the difference between people owning what they're saying. There should be a whole bunch of markers for that in body language, and not just one body language, but a variety of markers. And those type of people, like when I'm interviewing people, I'm looking for those body markers on them. So I know that, when they're phoning me saying, I can't go where I've been hunting for the last 15, 30 years. Or I talked to the wife and they say, he came in at 11 this morning, his face was just totally white, like he saw a ghost. So I have an outside source now that's saying that, and saying, well, what's that all about? And the guy says, I don't know. And the other thing too is, you would think that people who saw Sasquatch would say, well, I saw a Sasquatch. But a lot of times you'll find they don't want to tell you they saw a Sasquatch because they don't want to look crazy. But you have to learn to help people, not say, well, I think I saw your Sasquatch. I don't even say that. I don't want to fill in the blanks in my mind, because that's leading the witness, you could say. Instead of, I want to hear their reality of how they view things and how they look at things and that kind of stuff. So.
While I've heard various encounters like the ones shared by these BC researchers from across the United States before, hearing about the effects of PTSD and trauma on certain witnesses is not something commonly discussed within this topic. How is it that even in a place like British Columbia, which is so synonymous with Sasquatch, people are still hesitant to share or openly talk about their encounters? That part surprised me, especially given the local embrace of the topic, as you're about to see. As mentioned by Thomas Steenberg earlier, the town of Harrison Hot Springs is the so-called gateway to Sasquatch country in British Columbia. There's a noticeable local embrace of the creature that adds a certain charm to the town. But there is a more serious side to it as well. The Harrison River Valley Visitor Center doubles as a Sasquatch museum, which has informative displays about the topic, its history, many of the researchers involved, as well as footprint casts and more.
I'd love to get you to talk maybe about this one.
Okay, well, this is one of the best castings in British Columbia ever. It was cast by the late Robert Titmus in 1974 on the Skeena River. It's known as the Terrace Sasquatch footprint.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's
there was
quite
actually a
far
number of tracks found. We only have the one, but there was actually 4 of them.
And that's quite far north, correct?
Yes.
It's almost towards Alaska.
It was beautiful. It was in soft, just wet mud. If it was made by a creature, it just stepped in perfect conditions as it walked through this wet spot. Not too far from the road.
And you spent time with Titmus.
Yes, I spent a lot of time. Titmus was an absolute. He shunned publicity, but he was a first-rate researcher. And best friends with John Green. Unfortunately, the last 10 years of his life, he was bothered by nagging back problems, so he didn't get out too much. He lived right here in town in Harrison Hot Springs in John Green's old house.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just outside of town is the Sasquatch Provincial Park, which I'd been wanting to check out for quite some time. Well, we're about to take a kind of a side-by-side tour here. Everyone's loading up into the little mobile. So right now we're on the side of the mountain near Harrison Hot Springs, and a bit of a ATV tour, and talking to the tour guide about different sightings that have happened in the area, whether the logging has affected it or not. This area does have a long history. Obviously, this is Sasquatch Provincial Park too, so that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of history here in this area, even though it's right kind of at the start of this whole BC mountainous region. You can see going down this way. Very dusty, a lot of people ATVing out here. You know, to me it just kind of seems like the beginning of the potential habitat for Sasquatch up here in BC, more than anything.
But, I mean, like in terms of the actual Sasquatch sightings, are sightings on the decline or I mean, are they?
No, actually, they're actually
steady?
pretty. They're pretty steady. Last year there was a sighting that got a buzz in town, and people were talking about it. And yeah.
So this is Sasquatch Provincial Park beneath us. Long history of sightings in this area, documented heavily through the works of Thomas Steenberg and others. Beautiful area.
Right on top there's a plateau.
Yeah, what a view. This is what you think of when you think of British Columbia. I think of this type of an area. Such a long history. Harrison Lake, just all these remote places all along the lake here. See all the logging that's happened here. Feels nice getting clean a little bit. Cheers.
Not after you.
Nice and cool?
Yeah. That's long.
It was along Harrison Lake that Thomas had his own potential sighting of a Sasquatch.
March 2004, up course 20 Mile Bay up the west side of the lake. I was taking John Miles back because he's the caretaker up there. And on a cut line where the big power lines go through, just above where the entrance to Mystery Valley is, I saw a figure walk from the center of that cut line to the trees on the right hand side. And remember, my personal philosophy since I began has always been stick to the facts and never deviate from the facts. The facts are, I saw a figure. The facts are, it was jet black in color. The facts are, it appeared to be walking upright. But the facts also are, it was almost a mile away and I couldn't see details, so I can't say with 100% certainty it wasn't some big weird looking man I saw way up there. But the way I remember it, this thing was big, even for a Sasquatch. So, if that was a Sasquatch, I've seen one. If it wasn't, I still have one.
That evening, myself and the STM crew geared up to take a boat ride on beautiful Harrison Lake, as well as head down the Harrison River to scan the shoreline with thermal cameras. So we are on Harrison Lake, doing a river tour / lake tour, and once it gets dark, we're going to be looking and scanning the shoreline for anything with the thermals, so that'll be kind of a cool experience. It's right before sunset now, so we're just kind of getting a feel for the area. It's a really beautiful spot with the water, but it'll be kind of cool just maybe scanning from the shore. Might be a way to spot some kind of wildlife. I'm hoping to see maybe a bear or something. Obviously a Sasquatch would be nice, but anything from the shore would be really cool if we're just kind of trolling with the motor and slowly going past the shoreline. That should be kind of cool.
I see a mountain lion. How sick would that be?
Dude, a mountain lion or a bear would be amazing.
Yep. It's not hot though.
What is it, Alex?
There's something swimming up there. It just went under, I think. Yep.
Yeah, you could see it.
Could be a little, probably an Ogopogo. I told you we were going to get a lake monster. He said it could be a seal, okay.
He said they saw 22 seals the one time sunning themselves.
Whoa.
Yeah, well, in October. This point right in here. So I guess this is the narrowest part of the river, and it has the nice low-laying land. They can climb up over here and climb down over there.
Huh. So maybe this is a good spot then.
Yeah.
Yeah. How you feel about that?
He hasn't done the sound thing.
You want to do a pop one?
Oh, do a pop? Here, and somebody needs to hold the later. Here we go. I'll do another one.
Maybe like push this thing on and go a little further down the river past all these houses.
Let's do it.
You guys want to get going, get moving down the river a little? Because we're right now we're basically surrounded by houses on both sides. See any wildlife at all?
No. I mean, I've seen birds or bats. It seems to be it.
Alright, I'm gonna call it.
Alright. Guess that's a wrap.
While we had scanned the river for a couple of hours, we did not see much of any wildlife. But perhaps the areas around the river had more of a human presence than we had expected. British Columbia was the longtime home of one of my personal favorite researchers of the Sasquatch topic, wildlife biologist Dr. John Bindernagel. Bindernagel unfortunately passed away in 2018, but if there were anybody involved with this topic I would have liked to have met, it would have been John.
The late John Bindernagel, he was a gentleman, a very, very brilliant scientist.
A very, very kind person too. I mean, we'd be at conferences and I would see him take as much time listening intently to somebody that, didn't really have anything really to tell him, but they were just excited to be around there, and everyone he took at face value. He was a very, very personable person that way and made everyone feel as though what they were passing on to him was very, very important.
I met him a couple times on expeditions over on the island. Wonderful man. He was, an absolute delight. He put it out there. He says, here's my number. You have any questions anytime, give me a call. And you could call him.
I mean, that was a great attribute of John's. He was very approachable. And I think in a lot of ways you have to sort of be that way if you want to find out information about eyewitness sightings from people where they're very hesitant. I remember John always telling me too, he said, I'll be at a talk or a conference and there'll be people that'll be listening and everything, and then afterwards a few people come up and they ask very general kind of questions. He says there's always some people sort of standing at the back, and you can tell that they want to come and talk to you about something, but there's just too many people around. And he says, usually I'm packing up all my stuff at the very end and now there's hardly anybody there. And then they'll come over and say, like, I had this sighting and they're very, and he says, that's, you can tell that there was something really, really bothering them about something they had seen. They can't explain it in a normal way, but here's somebody that's saying like, oh yeah, these things are around and here's their behavior and everything. And this person's like, oh, this is, this thing that I saw or experienced, it's being validated that I'm not going crazy kind of thing.
A very open-minded fellow, There's an old expression in British academia, the road to Loch Ness, and career-wise it's not a good road to be on. John Bindernagel said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And he started off in Ontario like I did and got interested and came out west. And he got the Sasquatch bug and he just couldn't let it go. He couldn't. Brave individuals like him, the late Grover Krantz, and Meldrum today, despite the opposition and their colleagues talking behind their backs, they didn't care. They had the courage to look at it. And we'll always be grateful for that. And John, I knew him well. He was a gentleman. I miss him.
With his background in zoology and biology, he was able to look at this as if it was no different than looking at any other kind of an animal. And he worked in Africa with Jane Goodall. He worked in the West Indies, and he was doing research down there for quite a few years. And he really wanted to, when he retired, come and move out to BC because he did a lot of freelance work. And he told me, he said, you couldn't be a freelance person looking for work, bidding on contracts to do environmental, biological work for governments or for things like that if the first thing on your resume is Sasquatch. Just because of the perception of like, oh, that's not a real animal, why are you wasting your time kind of thing. But he realized that with many people seeing this, there's so many similarities between what they were seeing, the behavior of what they were seeing. This wasn't just random people hallucinating or this kind of thing, that these eyewitness sightings were sort of the basis of that whole voyage of discovery, of starting off where you have eyewitness reports, you've got now tracks, tangible evidence. We've had lots of hair samples. Unfortunately, with hair samples, we need to have a dead Sasquatch to compare that sample to see if it is a Sasquatch. So there's these kind of pitfalls that happen in research that way.
There's a plant book that he turned me on to because I'm like, John, I need something for local plants, so I can figure out exactly what's out there, what the great food sources are, and uses, and even medicinal stuff. Principally because there were some things like there was a sighting on Harrison West back in the 80s, Well, a gentleman was driving down the road and he saw something hunched over in the ditch, jumped up, ran up the hill. He stopped, he went to where this thing was squatted in the ditch, and he saw little bits of devil's club root. And it had been in there washing the devil's club root and made a nice, neat little pile. What is antibacterial and antifungal properties? So maybe he's got a bad gut, he knows. I'll eat this. So it's, all those things you can learn from a great resource like that book. It was put together by a colleague of his, Andy McKinnon. And if my memory serves me, he taught at UVic. And he would give lectures to his students about these plants and their uses with the natives. And sometimes he would say that, and if Sasquatch is real, it would probably eat this too.
That's great.
Yeah.
Without the arduous work and dedication of researchers like John Bindernagel, John Green, Rene Dahinen, Bob Titmus, and even those who came before them and after them, the legacy of Sasquatch research in British Columbia and around North America would likely be very different today. Within the Sasquatch topic, you have a variety of stories that are considered to be classic, older stories that predate the modern concept of the topic. Infamous tales like the Bauman story involving President Teddy Roosevelt from 1892, or perhaps like the Ape Canyon attack near Mount St. Helens in Washington state from 1924, or even stories of the abandonment of the town of Portlock on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula in the 1940s and 50s. Of these classic stories, quite a few of them are said to have taken place in British Columbia. Stories like that of Albert Ostman, who claimed that in 1924 he had been abducted by a Sasquatch and held captive by a family group of the creatures while in a remote area of coastal BC. Another one was the previously mentioned William Rowe encounter in BC's Rocky Mountain region from 1955. There is even the wild Jacko story in which it is claimed that a juvenile gorilla-like creature was captured in 1884 in Yale, BC, not far from Harrison Hot Springs. Most researchers believe the Jacko tale to be a hoax, however, but nonetheless, it is said to have taken place in BC. Of these classic stories, it was the 1941 Ruby Creek incident that seemed to attract the most attention, both locally and with researchers like John Green and Rene Dahinen. Jason Zackerson took us to the general area where the Ruby Creek incident is said to have taken place, fairly close to Harrison Hot Springs.
Well, 1941, and Mrs. Chapman was at home alone with the kids. Her husband was away. To my recollection, he worked for the railway, so he was working on the railway lines. And her two young children came running in the house exclaiming, "Mummy, Mummy, there's a cow outside." Mrs. Chapman stepped out the door, and that was no cow. She was quite frightened, so grabbed the kids and ran out of there as fast as they could out to town, and she was not going to return to that place. But people did return to the house, only to find it in pretty rough shape. A large wooden barrel full of salted salmon smashed on the floor, and a few salmon gone. So that was enough for them to say, I think it's time to find a new place to live, honey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of that story as well is the tracks that were found around, because that became then a thing that could be corroborated and compared, and that caught John Green's attention, right?
It certainly did, yeah. And then, then he was off to the races.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, I tell you, he did a lot of work. He did a lot of groundwork in regards to this mystery.
Yeah.
So, he's been it's a lasting legacy that he's left us.
Yeah. So is this only a historical story, or are there still Ruby Creek encounters that people are having?
Well, there has been. As recent as 2008, 2009, there was a gentleman just down in this valley out in the fall for deer. He's walking a spur road, and there's a swamp to his left, and he catches an enormous rock out of the corner of his eye, flying through the air, lands in the swamp close to him. So he's frozen. He's like, that was a big rock. What threw that? And then he heard some movement, looked into the alders, and saw a massive black figure moving through. He couldn't get anything good and definitive, but as far as he could tell, it was something bipedal. And it just took off, and up the hill it went. And I think that was the end of his hunting for that day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Understandable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There were some tracks that were found?
Yes.
In regards to
later on, 2 or 3 days later, Thomas Steenberg, Bill Miller, and another gentleman, Jerry, his last name escapes me, but they took a wander into the swamp, into the alders, into that little bit of high ground, and Thomas was able to cast one print out of there, where you can pick up, it's discernible, a big toe that's in the ground.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Any other recent stories from right around here?
From right around here, well, there's the John Kirk sighting that you're aware of. So that would have been 2017. But nothing public, to my knowledge, has come out here lately. Interesting, though, in 2010, of course, Vancouver hosted the Winter Olympics. And we had a gentleman from NBC News Atlanta who, as a child, grew up in BC, then his parents moved stateside. And he wanted to do a piece on Sasquatch. So his plan was he was going to come out and do a little trip with us at night to, see all the technology, the thermal imagery, the night vision. But he couldn't make that because of his Olympic commitments. But he came out during the day, the next day. So we just wandered down a trail, and then he was asking us to relay stories, history of the area and Sasquatch sightings. And then he asked us about the wood knock thing. So we told him a little bit about that. It's an assumption that a lot of people make that they utilize banging rocks together, rock on wood to communicate with each other. So in any case, he decided that, let's do a demonstration. So I wandered around, found a suitable piece of wood. He set his camera up, and it's on what they call Deer Lake Trail. And so behind him was a very steep bluff. So he's got his camera set up. He's filming. I do a knock, and we stand there patiently waiting for a reply. Well, I'll be damned if we got one. But the best part of the whole thing was this gentleman from Atlanta. He's bending over looking at the camera, and he stands up and he goes, "Y'all heard that, right?" Yeah, that was funny. That was astounding. I mean, and we all just rolled our eyes. Like, it always happens. You bring somebody up for the first time and they find a print, or this happens, or that happens.
Yeah.
We go for hundreds of hours and get nothing. But we bring somebody along and they go, "Oh, look what I just saw back here." Right?
Yep.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
How long have you been active in the search?
Really active since 2006. I got started sort of in 2000. It had always been in the back of my mind. I'd worked in forestry in the 90s. I'd thought about it and asked a few followers, but it was like, wasn't a big topic of conversation, right? And nobody wants to lose their job because, a giant spotted owl is now in the woods. But 2006, I took a trip down to Northern California, went on an expedition down there. It was horrible. 2 back-to-back Pineapple Express, raindrops as big as shooter marbles. So Matt said, well, listen, that was horrible. Why don't you go on a second trip? Don't worry about it. You won't have to pay. So I went on the island, and I guess I made a good impression. So Matt said, well, you want to be an investigator? And so attended dozens of expeditions over the years, started doing my own in 2016 up the Harrison watershed. And relatively fruitful, drummed up a number of visuals. Sadly, we didn't catch anything. But I mean, like I said, it's the nature of the beast. The sightings are often just fleeting.
Right.
And I can see why people don't catch them on camera. I've been running down a logging road. I've got a camera in my hand. I see a big bull elk come out onto the road, you just stand there and gawk. You don't want to distract with the camera because you want to take in every second of what you're seeing. So it doesn't surprise me that there aren't many photos of these things. You know, A, the sighting is fleeting, and B, you're standing there gawking, and especially for somebody who thinks these things don't exist. Yeah, they just stand there and absorb what they're seeing.
Right. Yeah.
And then they think about who they're going to tell.
Yeah, I mean,
Which is often nobody.
Yeah.
not only that,
right.
but just as you mentioned how fleeting they are. I mean, I've had a gigantic bull moose run out in the road in front of me, and by the time I had a camera or phone ready, it was already in the tree line and gone.
That's
We're
right.
talking
Yeah.
something that has, a 10-foot span of its antlers.
That's
so
right. Yeah, it's a
something
massive
that
beast.
maybe could blend in a little better, I could see might just be very difficult to even spot, let alone be able to film.
Well, earlier today, when I was driving you up that one road, oh, look, there's a bear. I saw it for maybe 3-4 seconds, bounding through the tall grass, and it hit the tree line.
Wow.
So, yeah, you got to have your head on a swivel, and I guess autofocus, sadly, is really what you have to do. And unfortunately, and so often they'll be in cover, and then snap, snap, snap. Well, what did it focus on? The big branch in front of it, right?
While in British Columbia, I got the chance to attend a local Sasquatch event called the Nicola Valley Bigfoot Conference, put on in a town called Merritt, BC.
Okay, I gotta get my truck off the road. We've got somebody coming in and dropping off equipment. Sure enough, it's an excavator. So I said, we'll just get off the road, we'll let him go by, and then we'll carry on up the road.
And I have a story of something like this, and I'm assuming that the Sasquatch now looks like this. Unless it's going to do the thing. So that's what is this thing that we begin to figure out in regards to what my reality of what I see.
While at the conference, I interviewed a local teen who made an interesting discovery nearby a few years prior.
Well, we took our dogs to the river because it was a nice day out, and well, we were walking. I glanced at it at first. I didn't quite notice it until I walked back, because when we were going there, it was off to the side of the path. It wasn't directly in the path, but when we were heading back, because it was starting to get a little too hot, we saw. I saw it out of my. It looked like a footprint, and curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over, and it was a decent sized footprint, and I was like, that's too big to be human. So I called my grandmother over, and she was baffled by it. So we didn't have plaster at the time, so we rushed home to grab some and cast it. What it looked like was it came across the river, and it looked like it looped back around, because it looked like there was a hole, like it stood and looked like it was almost bent down from where the stance was, because the toes were pushed in a little further.
I understand Thomas Steenberg somehow got involved? Did you guys then?
We contacted him, and we casted it and we sent it to him, and it was like, we want you to take a look at this, because you'd be able to identify if it's real or not. And he's like, yeah, you might have I don't remember exactly what it said, because this was quite a few years ago.
She asked me to verify it, and I thought, well, it looks pretty darn good, and she sent me a copy of the cast and the whole story. I interviewed her, I got the whole story down in the file, and I made a copy of the cast here for the museum here, and it's on display now. Yeah, that was only a few years ago.
We started to carry plaster since then, just in case we find something like that, because I'd say it's once in a lifetime, but it's almost like when you look for them, you don't find it. You stumble upon it, is when you're more likely to find them.
Yeah, this is the one that was found in Merritt on August 15, 2016.
And so what is it about the cast that intrigued you?
Well, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The conical shape. It's not that big. And I may point out, only the footprints were found. No one saw the animal that laid these. Yeah.
So the possibility that it was...
Yeah, it's a possibility.
It's a possibility it could be.
Yeah, because the creek bed where this was found was just outside of Merritt, and it was an area where a lot of kids like to go. Yeah.
Over the years, have you noticed in BC, has there been more sightings? Have there been less in certain areas, more in other areas? Kind of what are your thoughts on just from when you started to here? What's it like?
I don't think it's really changed. I mean, some years you'll get groups of sightings. For instance, Bridal Falls, which isn't far from here. My friend Bill Miller got 2 reports from the same night. So 2 different parties saw the monkey on the road, hours apart. That was interesting. Yeah, but to be honest, no real pattern, no significant change. Not a lot, not reports falling off. It's and again, it's all relative to people talking, right? Like John Green once surmised that he figures for every person that comes forward and tells him about something that happened, he says there's at least 4 other people that aren't going to tell a soul.
British Columbia is a huge province. Whenever people say like, well, they've, pretty much everywhere has been explored and everything. Well, I mean, there's still a large number of like airplanes that have gone missing in the Pacific Northwest that have never been found. Even on Vancouver Island, about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, some people in an area where we often head out and do our Sasquatch research, they were up there looking at logging some of the cedars that were quite high up on a mountainside. So it was very unrealistic using standard logging practices of trucks and yarders and everything to get these logs out. They were going to be going in there with a helicopter where they cut the logs down, then they chain them up and haul them out. They came across an airplane that had been missing since 1944, 45. I think there was 3 crewmen on board, but they found the plane, and then they actually found some of the remains of the crew. But that plane had been sitting there for like 75, almost 80 years before it was found. But it wasn't even moving.
Going forward, obviously being 2023, is there any advice you'd give to younger researchers or people that are just sort of starting their journey down the Sasquatch path, so to speak?
The best advice I can give to a new researcher, and I feel so sorry for new people in this today because there's so much stuff just dumped on your head. Adopt a philosophy like my own. Stick to the facts, never deviate from the facts, and don't go off on the wild speculation. And always keep a healthy dose of skepticism, because skepticism is one of the best qualities a researcher can have.
Learn, if you're specifically looking for Bigfoot or Sasquatch, learn what their environment is, what their requirements are. They need water, and there's a lot of reports are all found in and around lakes and rivers. So they need water. They need food as an apex predator that could be anything and everything. And they need shelter. A shelter could be just going up the mountain to a more secluded area.
John Green had no interest as a young man, but he started hearing about it in the 50s. And that's when he sort of climbed on board. Somebody came to him and said, John, this is serious, this is real. I mean, look at this, look at that. He played a large role in how I do my research. Because I asked him when I met him for the first time in 2007, I asked him if he could offer me one piece of advice. What would that be? He said, don't ambulance chase. He spent years, he'd be up here in Harrison, and he'd hear about reports in Northern California or Oregon, and he'd jump in his car and he'd drive down there, and he'd arrive on site days later. By then, half the prints had been bladed over by an excavator. Witnesses have had time to think about what they saw, clam up. So he told me, he says, pick a spot as close to home as possible. Look for historical precedents of sightings, and if there's a healthy ungulate, a healthy bear population, there's no reason to believe that you won't find something.
In British Columbia, I'm in Paradise, and there's a mystery here that needs to be answered, and I want to see it through, because as a researcher, in my opinion, it's just as important to investigate the possibility of its non-existence as its existence, right? I fully accept that the Sasquatch may be nothing more than a great piece of mythology and folklore. I don't personally believe that, but I accept the possibility. And if it does exist, well, it is a zoological discovery of the 20th and 21st centuries. Yeah.
Well, it's my last night here in British Columbia. Decided to take a little solo drive up into the mountains. I'm actually in a pretty historic area. I'm near Yale, British Columbia, which is allegedly the site of the infamous Jacko, juvenile Bigfoot Sasquatch captured, which is most likely a hoax, but it's a part of the history. And I'm not too far from a place called Boston Bar, which I believe is the site of another kind of sighting or incident of some kind involving minors. I've seen Hammerson Peters cover some of that stuff on his YouTube channel. Definitely recommend checking him and his work out. He's done some fantastic work here in the British Columbia area. But yeah, just thinking about BC right now, and I will be back in British Columbia. Absolutely. For now, this is part of an interesting journey. It's been almost 10 days here in British Columbia, just up and down and seeing how varied this province is, and obviously the historical aspects of it being the place where Sasquatch was born, in a sense, the word that we know. And I prefer the word Sasquatch over the word Bigfoot personally. I think it sounds a little less goofy. And yeah, it's just an amazing place. I think the people who are blessed to live here certainly don't take it for granted. But I think the stories are here, and it makes sense. This place really, in my view, is only second to Alaska. When I think about Alaska, and I think about just raw, uninhabited wilderness. British Columbia having most of the mountains in Canada, whether it be the Rockies or the coastal ranges, whatever, just the mountains on Vancouver Island. There's so much space and territory out here. It's really only second to Alaska, in my opinion, in North America. And that's, having said that, there's so much territory across the lower 48 and other parts of the US and Canada that have a lot of space. But out here, it's just, you get the feeling that something living out here would make sense. It would seem to be possible, I suppose. So those are just my wrapping up thoughts as I close up this adventure here in British Columbia. It's been quite interesting and been amazing to be here.